So welcome everybody. Thank you for being here with our Small Business Solutions Series workshops. We are very excited today to have Martin Golden, who is the Regional Director for this Portland area. For the small, actually it's much broader than the Portland area. Am I right, Marty?
Yeah, I'm actually currently the acting regional administrator for 4 districts, which is Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Alaska. And normally I'm the district director for the Portland district office, which is basically Oregon and Southwest Washington.
Wow, so you've got an expanded area and for the Small Business Administration, and in that expanded area, you're also managing through a pandemic. So thank you for your hard work, because I know you have been doing a lot of hard work, so I appreciate that. And I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. As I already mentioned, and Deanna did too, my name is Marty Golden. And so I'm going to be going over an overview of the different emergency aid programs. The thing to keep in mind here is this is not going to be an overview of the normal stuff that the SBA does, which we're still doing, by the way. Counseling, normal loan programs, disaster assistance, and other than COVID disasters, assistance with contracting. But the focus of this presentation is really going to be the programs that we have that are specific to the COVID-19 disaster and of course the economic problems that that's causing. So there's been some updates. We're restricted to what we can kind of put on these in our presentation. So this one is current as of February 5th. We know that there's been new legislation that was recently passed, and I'll talk a little bit about that and any updates from what you're seeing right here. So we've been working pretty hard over the last year to try to roll out the aid that our Congress has passed over the last 12 months. There's been numerous rounds of funding at this point. I think it's first worthwhile to point out that it's been an incredibly challenging time for small businesses. We know that a lot of businesses have shut down, a lot of businesses laid off employees. People are having an extremely difficult time in many cases responding to the closures. And so we're doing everything we can at the SBA to try to help there. We know that it's mostly up to the individual businesses to try to figure out a way out of this, but we are doing what we can to provide assistance. So our loan programs our programs for COVID-19 include grants and loans. The loan programs include the Paycheck Protection Program. That's a forgivable loan provided through a PPP lender. And so there's about 5,200 lenders in the United States right now participating in the current round of PPP funding. We had a few hundred more banks in the first round, but we were happy that the vast majority of the banks who participated the first time are participating still. The idea here is that you have a loan, and as long as you spend at least 60% on employee payroll and the other 40% on covered eligible expenses, that you'll be able to get that loan forgiven. So eligible expenses have been expanded and now include all of these: payroll costs, rent, mortgage, interest, utilities, operations expenditures, property damage costs, supplier costs, and any costs you expend for worker protection and to modify your place of business to make sure the workers are compliant with health standards. We've done debt relief. So on existing 7A, 504, and microloans, we had a program by which those payments were made by the SBA for 6 months. There's actually another round of that's come out. So banks will be notifying people, and many of these loans will be eligible for another 6 or at least 3 months, depending on, I know there's some different cases there, but so there's going to be another round of debt relief on existing loans. We have EIDL under grant and loan programs because there were some elements of both there, but the economic injury disaster loan is a loan that's provided through the SBA itself as opposed to through banks. That's the loan that was originally going to be up to $2 million, but for most people, the maximum amount was $150,000. And I'll be talking more about the terms of these loans later. We also had a targeted EIDL advance, which was basically money that was given out that did not have to be repaid. That was originally called $10,000, and then it was modified to be $1,000 per employee, for those of you who may have gotten that. There's a new program out that is going to be launching in the near future. We hope in early April, and that's called the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant. And that is going to be a grant up to $10 million for performing arts venues and things like that. So far, just to give you an idea of the amount of money that's been put out here, these numbers are as of late February, so we know they're already higher. But we've done about over 7 million loans for about $663 billion since the Economic Aid Act was, and since the latest act was passed in January, we've done 1.9 million loans for $140 billion. So if you include the over $200 billion done under the EIDL, we've put out about $1 trillion of loans to over 10 million loans nationwide for over $1 trillion, and we're still going. And so we know that most of these loans have gone to small businesses. I know there's been press that a lot of loans went to large businesses, but the reality is that 89% of the new loans that have gone out since January are for $150,000 or less, which means it's the smaller businesses who are getting 9 out of 10 loans. And that was basically true in the first round in 2020 as well. Just in the Pacific Northwest, we've had over 70,000 loans since January started, and it's more now because this was last month. So the top takeaways from the PPP program: we expanded eligibility, so there's an additional types of companies that are eligible now, including 501c6 organizations, chambers of commerce, things like that. You can now select a covered period from between 8 and 24 weeks, whereas before it started at 8 and then it went to 8 or 24. And so now companies have the flexibility of picking a period of time between 8 and 24 weeks. There's a second round PPP loan for those who already received and expended their first draw PPP. And a lot of folks are taking advantage of that. The vast majority of people who have done PPP loans starting in January have been the second draw loans. And we're no longer subtracting the EIDL advance from PPP for loan forgiveness. That was a thing we did last year. The idea is that Congress didn't want people double dipping, but that was causing a lot of confusion. And so at this point, it doesn't matter if you've gotten an EIDL. It won't change the amount of your loan that's forgiven on the PPP side. And there's a retroactive look back. So there's procedures that are in place to take care of the loans that were still outstanding because the EIDL was subtracted before. So I mentioned there were some additional covered expenses that were covered. The important thing here is that that you have to apply by March 3rd. Well, actually, you know what? As of a few minutes ago, I was going to say March 31st, 2021, which was true. But I saw a news flash as I was getting on this call that said Congress just extended that to May 31st and possibly June 30th. I haven't seen the whole thing yet, but it sounds like Congress just now extended the deadline to May 31st at least. So that's great news. So as I mentioned, there's some additional folks that are eligible now: housing cooperative, destination marketing organizations, chambers of commerce. And so I think the biggest category there is going to be the chambers of commerce and the DMOs, which are basically how towns attract tourism. That's what a destination marketing organization is. You still have to have 500 or employees or less. So just kind of talking about the second draw loan quickly. So this is a loan that's available for people who've already gotten the first draw. They're a little bit more restrictive. You have to have 300 employees or less as opposed to 500 or less. And you have to have demonstrated a 25% reduction in gross receipts. So in the first draw, you just had to attest that your business was negatively impacted, but there were no absolute standards as to what that meant. This time, you will have to show, demonstrate a reduction of revenues of at least 25%. The maximum amount, if you do so, is 2 million as opposed to 10 in the first draw. And I know this doesn't really affect the vast majority of businesses, but if you are one of the larger businesses, the maximum amount is 2 million. So the maximum amount of your loan will be 2.5 times your monthly payroll for either 19 or 20. You can pick whichever one is more advantageous. If you're in the food services and accommodation sector, which are those businesses which start with a NACIS code of 72, the maximum amount is going to be 3.5 times your average monthly payroll, up to 2 million. So for those really hardly hit businesses and accommodations and food sector, they've given you an extra turn, a larger loan. So as I mentioned, you have to have already gotten your first draw, and you have to have used it correctly. So if you didn't spend that money where you were supposed to spend it, then you wouldn't be eligible for a second draw. And I've already gone over the other things there. You also can't have covered periods which overlap. So, you have to have gone through your covered period on one before you can start on the next. That's actually relevant because there are businesses that didn't get a first draw in 2020 and got a second draw in 2021. And if you have an 8-week covered period, especially now with the extension to May 31st, which seems to be the case, then you could actually take a first draw and a second draw loan in 2021, as long as your covered periods don't overlap. So if you're planning to get a second draw and you haven't gotten the first draw, you're still in the middle of that, you should think about how that covered period might affect you. So how do you do this on the PPP side? You have to find a bank. If you have difficulty there, there's a couple of ways to look for that online. You can see sba.gov/lendermatch will match you, and then you can just try the local banks, most of whom are doing loans, although they don't all do loans for people who are not already customers. So I know that in some cases, banks will do a PPP, but you have to open a business account of some kind. And the application goes to the SBA where it's processed by us. We're not processing loans as fast as we did in 2020 because we're doing more upfront ID checks, try to avoid the fraud that we had in the first round with folks stealing IDs and things like that. And again, that March 31st deadline, it's still March 31st, but I'm guessing within a couple of days, it's going to be May 31st after they get done passing and the new legislation that seems to have passed today. So if you do have a loan left, what do those terms look like? Well, and you would have a loan left if, for instance, you made the choice to spend the PPP loan on something other than payroll and eligible expenses. So if you do that, which is certainly okay, it's not illegal or anything, just means that the loan won't be forgiven. If the loan is not forgiven, the remaining loan will have an interest rate of 1%. There isn't any collateral or personal guarantee required. There's no fees or prepayment penalties. For most people, the new loan would be 5-year maturity. It was originally 2 years, and then we gave the option after a few months to go to 2 or 5 years. By the way, if you do have a 2-year loan, you can ask your lender to extend to 5 years if you want, but it's up to them. And the 5-year period starts from the date that the money was dispersed. So we know that payments don't start right away. They start after you get notice of how much is forgiven. So if you've got a $500,000 loan and you have $490,000 forgiven and you have $10,000 left, then you'll start making payments and the payments will be due amortized over the remaining period. So if it took a year to kind of get there, then you'd have a 4-year remaining period. You do have to start asking, you do have to apply for forgiveness within 10 months after the last day of your covered period. Otherwise, you'll be given a repayment schedule for the entire amount of the loan. You apply for PPP forgiveness through the bank, which then in turn sends that application on to the SBA. There's a number of different forms to use for forgiveness. The vast majority of businesses can use, it's a 1 or 2 page form, and it only takes a few minutes to fill out. Some businesses that are more complicated or for larger loans, there's a longer form, but for most people, it's a pretty short form. Just remember, the banks have 60 days to review that PPP forgiveness application before they give it to the SBA, and the SBA then has 90 days to issue its decision on forgiveness after that gets from the bank. So it's not always going to be a really quick process, although in many cases it is. And keep in mind that your loans here are not federally taxable income. So unlike the situation where you might have a mortgage forgiven, a lot of people who lost their homes had their mortgages forgiven, but then they were taxed on the forgiveness amount. That's not true with a PPP loan. It's not federally taxable. Also, it's important to point out, and this is something that was not real clear last year, if you're using the PPP loan to pay for payroll or other expenses, you can still take those off of your taxes as expenses. So early on, there was confusion about whether that was possible. So people who were using $100,000 for payroll were then told they couldn't count that on their taxes, which would then raise their taxable income. But that's not true. You can still deduct those expenses. Let's talk a few minutes about the EIDL loan. This is the other main program that we had, not nearly as big as $200 billion so far, as opposed to $800+ billion on the PPP side. This is an actual loan. It's not forgiven. This is the same program we've had for 50, 60 years. It's just that it was called for COVID-19 instead of flood or tornado or something like that. So these loans are 30-year loans. The terms are 3.75% for businesses, no prepayment penalties, and some security requirements. Again, you have to have 500 or fewer employees. And by the way, the payments on these loans are not due for, it was 12 months. Now it's going to be 24 months. They've just made that change in the new legislation. These loans you apply for on our online portal. It's a pretty easy application. And practically speaking, you can get up to $150,000. It's supposed to be 6 months of expenses, basically working capital. But if you happen to be eligible for $1 million there, at this point they're limiting it to $150,000 due to the amount of money that they have. So we made decisions. The SBA made decisions about some of these loan maximums based on trying to get loans to a lot of people as opposed to a lot of money to a few people. That's why the change was made. We also have a targeted EIDL advance. So this one takes a couple minutes to explain. So if you remember, for people who applied for an EIDL last year, there was a checkbox on the last, right before you submitted, that says, would you like to be considered for a EIDL advance? EIDL advances were funded by the CARES Act legislation. It was a different pot of money than the normal EIDL loan is. And so the idea was they were going to get people money right away, as opposed to waiting for the EIDL loan itself to be processed. And whether or not you took the EIDL or even approved, you could get the EIDL advance. So initially this was marketed as $10,000, or I think they said up to $10,000. They quickly realized they weren't going to have enough money for many people if they did that. And so the decision was made to make the loan, the EIDL advance, to $1,000 per employee. So if you're self-employed, that was one employee for $1,000. If you had an employee in addition to yourself, that would be two employees. So you would get $2,000 on up to $10,000. And so most people got something less than $10,000. So, and then at some point in the fall, they ran out of money there completely. And so even people who were completely eligible for the EIDL advance didn't get it because there was no money left. So this targeted EIDL advance program is meant to address that situation. And they're focusing on, businesses which are really hurting. So if you have a business in a low-income community and you can demonstrate that you suffered greater than 30% economic loss and have less than 300 employees, you would be invited by the SBA to register on a portal, and they'll make a decision after looking at your demographic data and location to then top up your EIDL advance. So if you had gotten $5,000 last year under the EIDL advance, and you qualify under these conditions I just mentioned, you could potentially get another $5,000, and that's free. That's a grant. So that would take you to $10,000. That is going to be an invitation-only program. So there's nothing you can apply there. The SBA is just going through all the EIDL advances that were put out last year and sending emails to people that got less than $10,000. We've already gone through that list, so most of those invitations have gone out. Now they're working on a list of people who got no money because there was nothing left. And then as they're going to continue to broaden that as they have funding. They originally got 10 billion, I believe, and now they've got another 5. So there should be additional about $15 billion. Actually, I think my numbers are wrong there, but there's billions and billions of dollars that are in that pot of money. So I imagine there's going to be questions on that because I know it's pretty confusing. So when we get to Q&A, I'll be happy to answer those. One thing to point out here is you want to make sure that your information is correct because there is no reconsideration. If there's a mistake made on the application and it causes you to be rejected, then you will not get another chance at it. So some of the most important things that you can look at are making sure that the addresses, the social security numbers, the EINs, the name of your business between your bank account and your application are the same, they match. Make sure it's the right checking account. And so be very, very careful about making sure there are no inconsistencies, even phone numbers. Just try to avoid anything which will set up a situation where the SBA is confused by the information that you're given. Because as I mentioned earlier, there was a substantial amount of fraud before by, I think organized crime, criminal activities, and then just individuals. And so anything which raises a red flag will be blocked. And in this case, you won't even have a chance to correct it. So you want to be careful about that. Oh, by the way, there's always questions about if there's a legitimate email or something like that. We know there's some phishing going on. So anything that comes to you for the targeted advance will come from targetedadvance@sba.gov. So just keep that in mind. Okay, there's another program that's brand new, as I mentioned. It's called the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant. That was passed in the Economic Aid Act legislation in January. We are responsible for running that program. It's taken us a while to set it up, but it should go live sometime in early April. We're very optimistic about that. And it's going to be a chance for venue operators, and theatrical producers, and the other organizations you see listed here to get grants for up to $10 million. So they have to have been in operation as of February 29th, 2020. And there's a bullet point here which says you cannot have applied for a PPP loan after December 27th. That's actually been changed. So organizations that did get a PPP after December 27th, 2020 will be able to get an SVOG. It's just that the PPP loan may be subtracted from the grant, again, so there's not double dipping. But that particular piece of information there in that bullet point is no longer accurate. So the amounts of money they can get are going to be equal to 45% of their 2019 gross earned revenue. And then there's other ways of calculating it depending on when you started, if you started after January 1st, 2019. By the way, all of this information is in the SBA website. We have various FAQs. We have interim final rules, which are legislation, and you can see what the rules are for these different programs. That's really your best source of information. We in the district offices don't run these programs. We just kind of communicate with businesses in our districts, but we don't often know what the rules are because everything that comes out is in those IFRs. So if there's vagueness in the IFRs, if there's vagueness in the FAQs, it's really incumbent on the business to look at those and to make their best decisions about what would be the correct way to do it. If you call the district office, many times, not always, but many times, we're just reading it and trying to interpret it the same way you are. It's very difficult for us to get information internally, and that's partly because everybody's in the same situation. The SBA is just getting this legislation, trying to interpret it, trying to set up programs the way they think Congress meant to set them up. And then they put out these IFRs and FAQs, and that's the SBA's best thinking about it. So I would encourage everybody to go to the website and look at those for the programs that they're interested in.
Marty, I have a quick
So
question. If I could.
Sure, you bet.
So something around like a indoor skating rink or bowling alley that they're not, are they specifically, would they be considered like entertainment that would be eligible for one of these type of grants?
Well, that's where you would have to look at the FAQs and on the SBA's webpage and try to decide if you're in there or not.
Got it. Okay.
I don't know off the top of my head, but that's there's also, by the way, trade organizations I've noticed that they're working pretty hard to try to understand who's eligible and who's not. So if you're a member of a trade organization, oftentimes if you contact those folks, they're going to know because they're trying to figure this on behalf of every business that's in their trade organization.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is a cross eligibility between the different programs. Took me a couple of times before I could sort of understand this, but basically if you look for the PPP, you're, again, this is going to change because now you can get a PPP and an SVOG, although they'll subtract the amount. You can also get an EIDL, so you can always get an EIDL, no matter what else you've gotten. So now that I think about it, I would just tell people this is going to be more confusing because now it's out of date. Okay, we talked a little bit about debt relief. This is if you have an existing loan. And you should contact your bank to see what they're going to be doing in terms of having the SBA make the payments again for the other 3 or 6 month period. Okay, PPP, remember that's likely going to be May 30th instead of March 31st. Keep an eye on that closely. Because again, I saw that in a blurb literally as I was getting on the phone. So I guess officially it's still March 31st, so we'll see. We'll see about that. Okay, these are the different addresses for the districts in the Pacific Northwest. And we have a lot of social media at this point. So here's some social media. And so let me just kind of go over quickly the latest information based on the new legislation for the American Rescue Plan, which is what they're calling the legislation that was passed very recently. So we added another $7.25 billion to the Paycheck Protection Program. There's still plenty of money left there. We were anticipating having enough money to get through March 31st. I'm not sure we'll have enough money to get through May 30th. It depends on the pace of applications, which have slowed down. So you wouldn't necessarily want to wait till the last minute to apply for the PPP, because it's possible that the money will run out before the end of that May 30th. It's always up to Congress whether or not they want to add money to the fund. So they added $7.25 billion, which, given that the original was 250, isn't all that much extra. They had added additional funds to the SVOG grants, another $15 billion for the targeted idle, and there's going to be an extra $5 billion for the supplemental targeted idle, which I didn't talk about, but for businesses which are really hard hit, they may be able to get another $5,000 in addition to the $10,000 there, which would be a grant money. There's going to be a big restaurant revitalization fund, $29 billion for that. The SBA has been tasked with setting that up. And so since that just passed, we're in the very early stages of trying to figure out what that's going to look like. So that probably won't open for at least a couple of months, but that would be for restaurants and so forth. And let's see. Yeah, I think we can stop there and see if there's any questions.
Hi, I'm Gerald Pierce. Can you hear me?
I can. Thank you.
Okay. Our organization applied for a PPP loan the first round, and we received $223,000 on about May 4th. So then, as a couple months after that, we had options for other monies available. So we switched and we got some stuff through the state of Oregon and some other grants, and we didn't want to double dip. So what we decided was that we would use the 8-week period and then pay back the amount of money we didn't spend. And I think I started the application process for forgiveness, and I believe it was about 160,000 that we had used. And so where we are now is we stopped that forgiveness process. US Bank told us we could stop that, and we wanted to see what the new legislation would do. But it's my understanding that since we didn't spend all of our original loan, we are not eligible for a second round of PPP. Is that correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
Okay. Are there any provisions? Can we restart the clock on the remainder of the first loan or anything like that to take advantage of that money we still have, or possibly find a way to reapply for another loan?
Well, you're asking questions that are sort of beyond my technical expertise. You can give me a call in the district office and we can talk about it a little bit, but I think it would have to do, with it. I'm not sure you could, but I'm not an authority on it. So we can try to take it offline.
Could I get your number?
Sure. It's 503-326 5221.
5221. Thank you, Martin. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem.
Other questions or comments for Marty?
Well, while you guys are thinking about it, let me put out another piece of information. One of the changes that was made recently was, so in the first round of PPP, if a business had no net income or negative net income, they wouldn't qualify for any PPP or much of a PPP because the calculations are based off net income. So a lot of people felt left out. They were like, well, the businesses that are hurting already aren't getting any aid. And so there was recently a change made, very recently, so that the new calculations are going to be based on gross income. And I'm talking about sole props, things like that. And so now if you have Schedule C, they'll base a loan off of your gross income. So that means that all of a sudden, a lot of folks are now eligible for $20,000, up to $20,833, who would not have gotten anything before. So if you were not able to get a loan before, you can apply now and probably get one. The thing that's really painful about that, though, is that if you did get a loan, albeit small, they're not doing a look back. So that if you already got a loan based on your net income, you will not be able to go back and get more money because your gross income calculation would have been higher. And that's something that once it was passed was immediately upsetting to a lot of people. But right now, and I think there are conversations between Congress and senior people in the SBA to talk about that. Congress may, in fact, pass something, we don't know. But the SBA's position right now is that administratively speaking, we're not allowed and we're not able to to go back and redo those loans that were already done. So maybe that gets fixed, but in the meantime, if you were a business that did not get a PPP in 2020 because you didn't have enough net income to do it, you could apply now and you would be eligible for money this time.
Beth?
I have a question and a comment. I run a theater company and own and operate a theater. So my comment for you, Deanna, is I'm pretty familiar with the Shuttered venue program. And there is language specific in that bill around making sure that venues have an auditorium space and that one of their primary functions as a business is selling tickets. So I think that perhaps does exclude bowling alleys or indoor entertainment venues, but I'm happy to talk to you more about it, or if you have people asking, because I've been working on the national level with the theater communications group that's been advising SBA on it. So I'm happy to answer those questions. But for Martin, in terms, we are exploring a first draw PPP. And my question is, there was a safe harbor for those of us that run businesses that were closed due to governor's orders. And
Yeah.
My question is, though, now that the states are reopening, and for example, we're able to open at 50% capacity, but because of our company and our space, we can't really do that. So I'm wondering if that safe harbor still applies to us, because we certainly did reduce staff, and we will not be getting back to our pre-COVID levels within the next few months. So I'm wondering if that safe harbor provision still applies, given that it is likely, currently we are allowed to open at 50% capacity, but we don't have the capability of doing so. I'm wondering if you have any insight or that, or if that's too specific a question.
Well, I have talked to folks about that in the past, not your specific question, but there are things that are on these applications which are assertions, right? And so if the fact is that, they're talking about federal and state law, I think state as well as federal, and the governor did impact businesses, that's for sure. And so if you're asserting and you can, with a clean conscience, say that, complying with the governor's orders impacted your business, I think the safe harbor would apply to you. Even if the safe harbor, even if it's 50% open, it's still a restriction. So And the other thing, I don't want to be too cynical about it, but these things are not being questioned. There's nobody in the system looking to catch people up. I mean, if you got a $5 million loan, people are starting to check into those because of all the bad publicity about some of that. But for the vast majority of small businesses, we're just asking for your best efforts and don't willfully commit fraud. And, if you're on the wrong side of an interpretation, it's not even going to come up. Does that make sense?
That does. Thank you. That's very helpful. Thanks.
Well, Beth, since you have looked into the shuttered venue, I'll ask the question about event centers. So we have a couple of event centers in the area. Would they don't necessarily sell tickets outright, but they bring groups in that then potentially sell tickets and that they rent the space that they haven't been able to rent. Would they qualify?
I don't think so, but I am going to include link to the eligibility requirements in the chat for you, because what it basically kind of gives you 4 categories, and they are live venue operator, motion picture theater operator, museum operator, and talent representative. So it feels as though unless you are, because remember that it was NIVA and the independent music venues that really drove the legislation. So really they're looking at live music venues, live performance venues, places where people go purposely to see live performance. So my gut is no, but I'll drop that link in there, and happy to answer questions offline as best as I know.
Excellent. Thank you. I imagine the live music wouldn't count me singing in the office, right?
No.
And I suppose they'd like it to be good music too.
And it doesn't apply, as far as I know, Martin, to like restaurants. Like, a lot of downtown businesses have live music, but it doesn't apply to them because that's not their primary business.
Yeah, not only that, they don't have fixed seating. So you have to have, I think you have to have chairs bolted to the floor, basically.
Got it. That makes sense.
And they're going to, by the way, restaurants will be covered under the Restaurant Revitalization Act.
So that brings me to that question about it's a large fund for the restaurant revitalization.
Yeah.
What is that going to look like in terms of, and I know you said SBA is running it two or so months down the road before it's going to be launched. Do you think it's enough money to cover the harm that's happened to restaurants nationally?
Well, probably not, but I think the amount of harm, inflicted on the restaurant industry is probably incalculable. But we'll just have to see. We have literally no details on it whatsoever. I don't know what the size of the grants are going to be, who's going to be eligible, whether they'll have to prove, reduction in revenue. But I will say that the PPP program, the second round, it started, there was a round in 2020 which went within 2 or 3 weeks. It was amazing. And then they gave us another $200 billion. And we actually didn't spend all of that. We had quite a bit left over by August 9th when the program ended. And we have another 250 PPP, $250 billion roughly in January. And it's to be seen whether or not that's going to be completely spent. So we'll just have to see where the restaurant follows that trend or what. I mean, we'll see how fast the SVOG goes.
Right.
And frankly, I think the restaurant industry is probably much, much larger.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Other questions for Marty? Well, I guess, Marty, you've been around small business a long time. Talk us through what you think this thing's going to look like when we start in the recovery mode, and what's going to be what you would consider to be maybe things that are going to be outcomes that we haven't thought about or we haven't contemplated. I'm just kind of wanting a little intel around what the SBA has been thinking about recovery and local communities. What can local communities do to help our small businesses through the recovery process?
Well, there's going to be, I think, a lot of changes in small business. I mean, one thing that's going to happen as a result of this, I think you're going to have an entrepreneurship class, which is going to be very innovative, very creative. Folks, I mean, listen, if you're a small business owner, you already have to be innovative and creative because you've got to react to your market. But nobody was planning on this. And so the folks that are still alive have probably spent more time thinking about how to survive than they maybe ever have. And so we're going to have a lot of people who have been through the war and are going to be much, much better able to probably withstand shocks to the economic system going forward, because they're going to have exercised that muscle. Things are going to change, I think. Personally, I think we're going to go back. A year after this pandemic is over, I'll bet you're not going to even know that there was a pandemic in the sense that I don't think that we're going to be behaving any more differently than we did before the pandemic. I think in the office space category that things might change permanently there in terms of, people looking at teleworking as an option going forward. So I think there could be a significant impact permanently on the commercial office space industry. But I think it's kind of hard to know. I mean, we've already seen that there's obviously a lot of businesses who went under and a lot of people who are hurting very badly right now. I don't want to make light of that. But the economy, by reports, is stronger than most people were expecting at this point. Revenues to state governments have been significantly less harmed than many people feared. Oregon, I think I saw a report, their revenues were down about 10%, which was one of the worst, and so the economy for the most part has been more resilient than expected, and some people credit these programs for helping with that. I don't know, but it's kind of hard to predict, but that's sort of some of the things I see.
So we did have a question from someone who doesn't have use of their microphone, which is, and I appreciate this question being asked because they're asking about whether or not any of these programs are going to help businesses that potentially were opened after February 2020. I know we've got folks, or even March, I think some of them are even March dates, because we have businesses that were caught in, just signing their lease March 15th, but also, folks that were already in process of starting businesses, even some later than that. Anything for them in terms of help or support? It seems like that's sort of the deadline of operations. Yeah,
I'm not aware of anything that's come out that would offer relief to people who weren't yet up on their feet by then. And I know that's, if you had the bad luck to have started something in April or even March, I mean, look, if you're going to open a business in June, then you sign the lease back in, February.
Right.
And so you've got, expenses that were on the line, and maybe you decided to go forward, and you're right, there doesn't seem to be too much help for those folks.
I guess the one thing I would offer is that, there are dollars that are coming to the state, dollars that are coming to communities that are 100,000 in population or more. And I think one of the tasks that I look to the chamber is to find where are the gaps that those other dollars might be able to fill. And that might be where we take a look and see, if there's businesses like the Arcade in downtown Hillsboro that started, in March and aren't eligible. Is there additional help that we can have from these local resources that may not be available through the federal direct programs? And
I'm sorry, was that a question?
No, it was.
Was that a question to me?
No, just a comment from a standpoint of, thinking about as those dollars come to communities, where again, one of the things we want to do is look at the landscape and sort of survey the landscape and see if there's other places where there are gaps. I know that, and I don't know off the top of my head whether there was any, there's no direct program from a federal level for like commercial property owners. The state of Oregon set up a $100 million emergency through their emergency board, commercial property owners fund for $100 million, which we know is not going to be enough. So those are the kind of areas that we're looking at. You know, if there's not a direct federal program, are there some of these local monies that can be used to fill some of those gaps? Just a comment.
There was, I did want to add something here to make sure people understand. If you got an EIDL in 2020, the first payment date has been extended to 24 months from the EIDL. So it was 12, now it's 24. And if you got and that's actually not just for EIDL, that's PPP as well. And also all disaster loans made in calendar 2021, it's going to be extended from 12 months to 18 months. So if you happen to have those loans, then there's an extra 6 or 12 months before you have to start making payments.
Yeah, it's a lot to navigate. I don't know how you do it, Marty. How do you keep track of all of it?
I'm going to tell you, I don't. That's the bottom line. It's just too much. So many rule changes.
Right. It's the dates changing and those kinds of things are just really difficult to keep track of. And that's probably, I think, the biggest, you know, reverberation we're going to have in our economy is the businesses that have these loans and grants and those kinds of things, keeping track of when they need to, you know, start the forgiveness program or that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Is it Jelana?
That one stay at least.
I think Jelana has a question.
Sure.
Hi, thank you, Martin, for your presentation. Can we use PPP loans to set up payroll? I started my bakery about 6 months before COVID. You know, in the beginning, I could do all the orders and baking, but I really do need to bring on some assistant bakers. And through COVID, it's just been fluctuating. So I never felt like, okay, should I bring someone on now? But then the next month I would take a dip, but then the next month I would get more orders, and I just felt like,
yeah.
So now that I'm in a position that I definitely need some more employees, can I use the PPP to set up payroll, even if I don't? In a way, I do have existing payroll, but I've been using independent contracts.
Yeah.
So I don't get caught up where someone's dependent on me and we just do kind of these allotted times. I understand if I can't use it towards that, but I would like to make the 2 people I've been using actual employees.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can, if they're employees and you're paying their payroll, you can certainly add people, of course. Whether you can use the money to pay for payroll service or to make investments in a payroll system, I'm not sure, probably not. But what I would say is that money's fungible, right? So you can use the entire PPP to make payroll and then use other monies that you happen to have to invest in your payroll system. Can you do that? Would that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, just make sure you're not, I don't think you can do it for that, but you know, unless you have a hard time spending the money on payroll and some of those other expenses, then you don't need to worry about it.
And I even have the funds to set up. I've been holding back because I don't want to set up, get some employees started, and then maybe 2 months take a hit where, you know, business slows down due to COVID. And
right.
So I don't mind about covering the setup. It's seeing if, do the employees already have to be on payroll, or can I just use the PPP to start someone off from the beginning?
Yeah, you can, but remember the amount that you're given will depend on your historical expenses. So you may not be given enough money to cover your additional payroll. It's not that you can't use the money to pay those new employees, but if you use the money to pay the new employees, then you may not have money to pay your existing employees.
Okay.
Because the amount that you get will be based on your historical expenses, not your projected expenses.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
Jelana, remind us the name of your bakery.
Oh, Jelana's Bake Shop. Thank you.
Nice little
Online
plug there.
bakery. Order at jelanasbakeshop.com.
I'm on my way. Every time I see you in one of these shows, and I'm like, I always get hungry. I'm just like, I can smell the bakery wafting. All right, we are coming to the last 4 minutes of our program. Any final questions, comments, anything else? Marty, thank you for joining us once again. Really appreciate your always being available and willing to come and talk with us about these rather complex issues and helping us navigate all of these different programs that are going on. Really appreciate it. And it's really helpful, really helpful to the small businesses that are, I think we don't have quite the frenzy panic that we had March of 2020.
Yeah.
Which is nice. It's, it's one of those things that I think we're calming down a little bit, but it's still confusing. And so, and there's uncertainty, but we're getting to the end of, I can see the light at the end of a tunnel, and it's not a train this time.
Yeah, no, good point. And I'm very happy to be here anytime. And for all the folks here who have businesses, I wish you the very best of luck. And if I can be helpful, just give me a call.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today, and please stay safe, and we'll see you soon.